He was willing to pay a large ransom for his beloved daughter, but after hearing Chryseis's request, the great leader quickly refused the chance to release her. He threatened and insulted the priest, demanding that he not return to the Greeks' camp. He said that Chryses would be taken to his palace in Myra until Thanatos took her in her old age. Fearing the threats of such a powerful man, the priest of Apollo withdrew with his head down, but he knew he had a powerful ally who would not abandon him in a complicated moment. In front of the waves of the sea, Chryses began a fervent prayer addressed to the god Apollo, son of Zeus. With Leto he asked the luminous god to pour his vengeance on the Ons, for they had treated their priest who had the sacred insignia with arrogance, disrespecting the god himself. At night, the god of the silver bow began to punish the Greeks. At first he attacked their animals, but quickly advanced against targeting men. These men did not notice the terrible arrows shot by Apollo and fell slaughtered by a terrible plague. For 9 days the Greeks suffered from Apollo's punishment. Warriors one after another died an unworthy death. The funeral PS were constantly burning, and the Ons did not understand the reason for that heavy punishment imposed by the gods. Calus the seer, who had Apollo's gifts, already knew the reason for the god's immense fury, but he feared revealing the information without having a guarantee of protection, so he turned to Achilles, asking him to protect him from Agamemnon's fury, since he always punished excessively the weak who went against him. Achilles promised that he would protect his life. At a meeting among the chief leaders of the Ons, Calus revealed the whole truth. He claimed that the plague was because Agamemnon had offended and refused to return the daughter of Apollo's priest. To reconcile with the god, the great leader should return his war prey and offer a hecatomb to the god Apollo. Furious, Agamemnon vociferated against the seer, saying that he only prophesied misfortune and that he had never made an optimistic prediction. He said he would return his slave Chryses, for he wished only good for his men, but he did not think it fair that he be the only one to go without a prize. He thought it fair to receive a reward of equal value. Achilles said that there were no other cities to be plundered on the Trojan coast, so it would be impossible to find such a prize. But when Troy fell, he would be rewarded. Agamemnon said that Achilles couldn't fool him, making him wait, while he himself enjoyed the beautiful prizes. Achilles said he would return to Greece along with his mermens if Agamemnon disregarded the right to his prizes, but the king of Myra did not bow to the threat. He said Achilles could leave, for he would not be missed, but before that he would go to Achilles' tent to steal the beautiful prizes. Achilles was consumed by fury, grabbed his sword, and decided to advance against Agamemnon, but someone held him by the hair. He turned even more wrathfully, but found the image of the goddess Athena, whom only he could see. The goddess asked Achilles to calm his heart, and not to worry, for his true prize would soon be repaid to him in glories. Achilles put away his sword and told Atreus that he and the Greeks should not reckon with the son of Peleus and his Meriton. He also said that the Greeks would cry out for Achilles, but he would not appear to deliver them from the deadly blade of the magnificent Hector. Thus they all regretted that they had allowed such an injury. After he exchanged cheese of insults, Achilles left Agamemnon's tent full of anger in his heart. Odysseus decided to deliver Cress back to her father along with the animals that would be sacrificed in the magnificent hecatomb. Agamemnon's men went to Achilles' tent and searched for the beautiful Brises, who refused to leave. In the evening Achilles went to the seaside, where he knelt and wept. Thetis, his divine mother, approached her son to hear those laments. Achilles could not understand why he was so wronged. Even with such a short life, he wished the Greeks would pay for their injuries. Thetis knelt before Zeus's throne and begged him to help the Trojans during the war. After all, he was indebted to the goddess, for she had been responsible for saving him when the Olympian gods rebelled against Zeus and put him in chains. Zeus promised that he would assist the Trojans until Achilles' glory was repaired. Achilles retreated to meet with Agamemnon. The division between Greeks was all the Trojans desired. A Trojan spy reported to Hector, head of the Trojan army, all the events in the camp of the Ons, weakened by the plague, and already without their champions the Ons were deteriorated. Hector seized the opportunity to try to push the Greeks back toward the sea. The decisive battles of the Trojan War were about to take place after the conflict between Achilles and Agamemnon. A great Dissatisfaction spread across the Greek lines, but the leaders of the Ons managed to prevent an even greater rift. From dividing their warriors led by Hector and Paris, the Trojan army entered the battlefield. They knew that Achilles and his Myrmidons had withdrawn from the conflict without their best warriors. The Greek army already looked less threatening. Paris stepped forward and, waving his weapon, shouted and challenged the best Greek warriors to a duel suddenly through the Greek lines. And with his mighty shout, Minos, king of Sparta and disciple of Ares, opened the way through the On warriors, saying that he accepted the challenge. Paris's courage vanished at the sight of his rival. His knees trembled in terror. He retreated close to the Trojans, taking cover behind his powerful brother, but Hector felt outraged at such cowardice. He furiously insulted his brother to arouse the pride and courage of Paris. He, ashamed, apologized for his dishonorable attitude. Then Paris said that he would duel with Minos and that the winner of the dispute would have the right to keep Helen and all the stolen treasures. Greeks and Trojans made a compromise sealed through sacrifices. It was agreed that Helen would stay with the winner of the duel. High on the Trojan walls, King Priam and his court were waiting for the duel that could change the fate of Troy. The king asked Helen of Troy who were the great warriors he could see from up there. She pointed out and introduced to the king great warriors such as Agamemnon, Odysseus, and Minos, but she missed her twin brothers Caesar and Pollock. Paris and Minos equipped themselves with shield and spears ready to start the duel. The spectators held their breaths because of the tension. The silence was total. The Trojan prince hurled his spear with all his might at his opponent, but the disciple of Ares deflected the weapon with ease. Then the Spartan king made his attack. Minos threw a spear offered by the god of war with the intention of killing the enemy. Although Paris blocked the enemy attack with his shield, it could not contain the enemy's strong weapon, which pierced it and wounded the handsome Trojan prince. Paris dropped his shield and picked up his sword, preparing for a hand-to-hand duel. Minos and Paris exchanged sword blows, but the difference in strength between the Spartan king and the Trojan prince was remarkable. The disciple of Ares struck a strong blow with his shield, which threw Paris to the ground. Minos wanted to end the life of the man who had stolen his wife. Therefore he raised his sword and used all his strength to strike the fatal blow, but Agamemnon's bronze sword broke when it struck his rival's helmet. The king of Sparta cried out to the heavens, demanding to know what crime he had committed to be so severely punished by the gods. Grabbing his opponent's helmet, Minos dragged the Trojan prince along the ground. The Ons were already celebrating the victory of their champion when the leather buckle that fastened the helmet to Paris's head broke and the prince crawled away from his opponent. When the Spartan king was ready to kill the adulterous prince, a cloud of dust covered Paris. Through the mist, Paris was visited by the goddess Aphrodite. She, using her powers, led him away from the fight. Minos was furious at the disappearance of Paris, shouting for him to appear. Due to the Trojans' escape, he considered himself the winner of the duel and claimed his prize. Agamemnon, the chief of the Greek expedition, demanded that the Trojans immediately hand over Helen so that there would be peace between the two peoples. On Olympus, the goddess Hera, wife of Zeus, was watching everything and did not want the war to end without Paris and all the Trojans being punished. Zeus questioned the reason for such fury against one of his favorite cities. The goddess Hera responded by saying that he could destroy any of her favorite cities such as Argos, Mia, or Sparta as long as he allowed Troy to be completely devastated. Zeus allowed Athena to mingle among the Trojans to spread discord. Athena, who also hated Troy, whispered in the ear of Pandarus, an excellent Trojan archer, saying that the glory of whoever defeated Minos would be enormous. Pandarus fired one of his arrows at the Spartan king, hitting him in the waist. The arrow fired by the naive Pandarus ended the chance for peace between the two peoples. The heroes of both sides ordered their warriors to attack the enemy. The war, which had lasted for more than 9 years, entered its bloodiest phase. Great heroes died, and even gods shed their blood in front of the Trojan walls, to the great satisfaction of the god of war. After the Trojans spurned their agreement with the Greeks, a great battle began. Heroes from both sides fought bloody battles, and even the gods participated in the dispute. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, was on the side of the Greeks. Apollo encouraged the Trojans in the fight. Ares, the god of war, was followed by a sinister procession which carried All the evils of war, the goddess of discord, strove to keep burning the flame of hatred that impeded the two peoples from finding peace. Deos and Phobos, the sons of Ares, filled men with fear and terror. Ajax, the gigantic Greek warrior, after slaughtering a renowned Trojan hero, began to fight for the spoils. The fallen enemy's weapons and armor were true trophies. These spoils of war had not only economic value, the status of these trophies was priceless among the great warriors. Fighting on the Greek lines was Diomedes, son of the renowned warrior Teus of Aetolia. He looked like a true demon on the battlefield. All those who crossed his path were defeated. The Trojans, faced with the enormous carnage, began to retreat, fearing Deos and Phobos, but the god Apollo did not allow the men of Troy to be overcome by fear. With the gods' support, the warriors of Ilium returned to the fight. The formidable archer Pandarus wounded the great Achaean hero again. Shooting at Diomedes, Pandarus, his arrow pierced Diomedes his shoulder. The Trojan archer celebrated and boasted that he had brought down the unstoppable Greek warrior, but Diomedes had not fallen as his aide extracted the arrow from his body. Athena and instilled in the hero the vigor and daring of his father. The goddess told him that he had nothing to fear, for she would always be at his side regardless of the opponent. Diomedes hurled his spear, trying to hit Pandarus in the mouth, who is mistakenly celebrating his victory over Titus's son. The blow was terrible. Pandarus fell to the ground and Diomedes walked over to him to pluck out his spoils. But Aeneas did not allow his friend's body to be plundered and tried to defend the corpse with a large boulder. Diomedes attacked Aunus. The heavy stones severely wounded the Dardanian prince's leg, who fell to the ground. Diomedes was ready to make another famous victim, but the goddess Aphrodite descended to earth to rescue her beloved son. As she lifted Aunus up, the unthinkable happened. Diomedes threw one of his spears at the goddess, wounding her hand. The goddess wept as the divine ichor, that is, the blood of the gods, gushed from her hand. Aphrodite complained to Zeus, but he told her that he did not want to get involved in the quarrels of men. That was the job of Ares and Athena, the warlike gods. The god Apollo placed himself between Diomedes and Aunus, but even that did not stop the Greek hero's momentum. Diom attacked Apollo, who dodged the hero's blows, but Diomedes' insistence enraged Apollo. The shining god gave a loud cry and warned Diomedes how foolish it was for a mortal to try to equal a god. The son of Tydeus walked away, and Apollo led Aeneas away from the conflict. Beside Hector, Ares was leading a powerful counterattack against the Greeks. Hector's men seemed not to fear death and fought with unprecedented audacity. Athena knew that the ruin of the Greeks would happen if Ares was not stopped, and she could only count on Diomedes to stop the god of war. Ares was Aphrodite's lover. Upon seeing the man responsible for hurting her, he felt an enormous rage. He hurled his divine spear at the hero of Argos, but Athena deflected the spear, preventing Ares from killing her protege. Diomedes hurled his spear at the god of war, and guided by Athena, the spear pierced his belly. His cry of pain was equivalent to the cry of 10,000 men. Ares fled to Olympus and showed the wound to his father, who told him to stop his whining. The supreme god hated the fact that his son worshipped violence and blood. He was the deity Zeus liked least. Without Ares on the battlefield, the Trojans' advantage was over, and the Greek troops were able to contain Hector's advance. The great Trojan hero could not find his brother Paris anywhere, so he returned to the city of Troy to confront his brother. For his courage, Diomedes was celebrated among beyonds as the man who faced and smote the gods. His deeds became eternal. Hector hurriedly returned to the city of Troy in pursuit of his brother Paris, who was nowhere to be found on the battlefield. The chief of the Trojan host stormed into Paris's palace and spotted him sulking in his room. While Helen looked disgruntled at the way he was behaving, Hector yelled at his brother, telling him how shameful it was that he remained apathetic in his palace while his brothers and countrymen were shedding their blood in a war that he had ignited. It was Paris's duty to put on his armor and stand in the front line. Helen lamented that she was the cause of such tragedy. If only she had been united with a brave man, her fate and disgrace would have been more bearable. While looking for his wife to say goodbye before heading back to combat, Hector was mobbed by the wives of the warriors who fought by his side. They anxiously asked him about the state of their husbands. The prince understood the dire situation that the wives were in, but had no way of answering so many questions. Finally Hector met with his wife Andromae, who was joined by a servant girl bearing their son and heir. Anx on her lap, his wife emotionally embraced him, saying that one day his courage would be the reason for his death. She begged him not to expose himself to danger because he was all she had left, considering that Achilles had killed her parents and brothers. But Hector said how much of a coward he would be if he sent his men to their deaths while he was completely safe. He knew that Thanatos was always around, but he didn't fear death. His only fear was that after his fall his wife would be enslaved and the captor would display her as a trophy, saying that she was Prince Hector's wife. Hector stretched out his arms to take his son, but the child was frightened by his father's imposing helmet. The prince laughed, took off his headgear, and said goodbye to his wife and son. He was ready to take on the bravest of Greeks. Returning to the battlefield, Hector took the lead of his men and hollered loudly for all the Greeks to hear that he was there to challenge any Greek warrior brave enough to face him in single combat. Even though Minos was wounded, he tried to come forward but was restrained by his brother Agamemnon. He said that it was foolish to defy such a man in his condition and simply lust for death. By now the Greeks' bravery seemed to knee, and they looked at each other hoping that some countryman would volunteer to confront the great Trojan hero, but no one came forward for the duel. Old Nestor, king of Phos, who many decades ago had been a great warrior but whose strength and agility had been eaten away by time, said that if he were not so old Hector would have already found his adversary. Nestor's address roused the spirits of several kings who volunteered for the duel. Among them were ODYSSEY, Diomedes, and the great Axe. There was a draw among the volunteers so that the gods could decide who would be the warrior to take on the Trojan champion. The great Ajax was the one chosen by the gods to face the one that many believed could only be matched by the mighty Achilles. But Ajax of Salamis was a true force of nature. No man among the Greeks could equal him in size, and with his gigantic shield, which no other man was able to carry, he came face to face with Hector. Hector's spears were not able to pierce Ajax's unbreakable shield. Meanwhile, the spears thrown by the giant pierced Hector's shield and almost took his life. The two heroes struggled with tremendous bravado until the sun dropped behind the mountains, preventing any indication of who was winning. The fight was stopped by the referees of both sides, and a draw was declared. Hector and Ajax greeted and praised each other for their performance. They traded gibes. They had started the fight as enemies, but eventually finished as great friends. An armistice was enacted, and hostilities between Greeks and Trojans ceased for a time. The bodies of the fallen fighters were collected by their colleagues and families, whereupon they could receive the rightful ferry, music, honors. While Greeks and Trojans were clashing on the battlefield, a major tussle between the gods was about to take place on Mount Olympus. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon were on the side of the Ons, while Aphrodite, Ares, and Apollo were helping the Trojans. This feud was about to lead to a civil war in the abode of the gods. Zeus called for an end to the turmoil that had erupted and struck a deafening thunderclap. The supreme god decreed that he would not allow any other Olympian deity to directly interfere in the conflict until further notice. Should any of them disobey his command, he would personally throw them into Tartarus if they wished to test his power. Zeus said they could stretch a chain connecting the earth to the heavens. Every other god together could measure forces with him by pulling from one end of the chain. High in the heavens he would raise all the gods and even the earth and the sea. As evidence of his omnipotence, Zeus went to Mount Ida, where he would set the course of the upcoming war events by himself. Fate had indicated that it was time for the Trojans to overpower the Greeks. Even though they were outnumbered, they were fighting for their families and their land. Favored by Zeus, Hector and his men pushed forward against the Greek hosts, who could not withstand the pressure. The Ons soon began to give way and retreated to their camp. All the while they were pursued by the Trojans, who followed them like rabid dogs. Paris fired a sharp arrow at the horse pulling old Nestor's chariot, who fell to the ground. Although old the king of Chios still kept the same bravery of his youthful days, he defended himself against the attackers with his sword. But Hector was drawing near with his fearsome spear, which had already brought down more than 100 Greeks. But the gods appeared to be watching over old Nestor. and he was eventually rescued by Diomedes. Diomedes wished to achieve glory by claiming Hector's life, but a mighty thunderclap revealed that this was not Zeus's will. The old warrior succeeded in dissuading Diomedes from confronting the Trojan champion. The Trojan proceeded to advance to the moat guarding the Greeks' camp. Hector even said that he would have burned the Greek ships had it not been for the arrival of Nyx, the goddess of the night, who blanketed the earth with her black cloak in Agamemnon's tent. The Greek leaders seemed supremely worried at the overwhelming victory the Trojans had achieved that day. The On's morale was at an all-time low. Nestor reminded Agamemnon that the Greeks' luck turned when the On supreme chieftain fell out with Achilles. The Maenian king agreed that it was a mistake, and he was now willing to rectify it. Ailes would be offered great treasures, slaves, and even the beautiful brows would be returned to him if he agreed to fight again. Odysseus and Ajax would present Achilles with Agamemnon's offer of reconciliation, which was indeed quite generous, but Achilles was undeterred. He said he would already have left if Poseidon would grant him safe passage. He had worked hard to get his spoils only to be later robbed by Agamemnon, and so he would not be fooled again by that man. During the night, Odysseus set out to spy on the Trojans and find out what they were up to. That's when they came across a man who was surely a Trojan spy aiming for an equivalent purpose to theirs. The Greek heroes forced the bloke to surrender and threatened him with death if he did not reveal some information of value to the Greeks. He said his name was Dolon, who owned valuable information that he would trade for his life. The Trojans said that King Rhesus of Sea and his men were camped nearby, and that they had with them their wonderful white horses reputed to be the finest in the world. Diomedes decided not to risk it, and did not spare the spy's life. Diomedes and Odysseus sneaked into the Thyaean nobleman's camp. The Ithacan king made his way to the horses while Diomedes provided him with cover. Diomedes assaulted the watchman from behind, but he was not silent enough. A soldier woke up and sounded the alarm, but his cry would be muffled by his knife. The Thyaean warriors woke up startled, unable to understand what was going on. All the while Diomedes ran among them, taking their lives like a ghost at Thanatos' behest. Diomedes' last casualty was King Rhesus. He and 12 of his brave warriors fell that night at the hands of Titus' son. Meanwhile, Odysseus to flee before reinforcements arrived. They reached the Greek camp, along with goddess Aurora, which heralded the birth of a new day. The two heroes were cheered by the Greek fighters for stealing Rus' mighty seeds, and that lifted the on morale nearby. However, Hector was giving a fiery speech to his men. He said that they would invade the Greek base that day and set fire to their ships. The fight for the retaking of the island beaches was just beginning. Hector sensed that the gods were on his side. He was hellbent on invading the On's camp and burning their ships, leading the attack on the Greek fortifications from the forefront. But Agamemnon would not allow the Trojans to storm the camp. Together with Diomedes and Odysseus, he would protect the camp gates. Agamemnon fought ferociously in front of his men until he managed to contain the impetus of the Trojan advance. Hector wanted to strike at the great Greek king, but was halted by the hand of the goddess Iris, who brought him a message directly from Zeus. She informed him that he should wait until Agamemnon was wounded. This was the sign the gods would send him to exert full pressure on the Greeks. Without Hector's resistance, Agamemnon seemed undefeatable. He went as far as to take the armor of a noble Trojan hero who perished at the hands of the great Basileus, but Agamemnon would eventually be wounded in the arm by the spear of a Trojan who sought to avenge his wiped-out relative. Hector ordered his men to move forward while the king of Maia was helped to retreat from the battlefield. Diomedes was now leading the Greeks under his powerful commanding voice. The Greeks were trying to resist, but the son of Titus had no idea that he was in the sights of Paris's bow. Paris's arrow pierced Diomedes, his foot cutting him through and pinning him to the ground. Albeit wounded, he insulted Paris, calling him a coward and a wife-stealer, and saying that he lacked the courage to confront a real man face to face. For this reason he hid behind his brother and fought at a distance with his bow. Odysseus back to camp, but now he was the only great hero left on the Greek front line. Odysseus bravely, but was harassed by several Trojan warriors. At this point he was unsure whether to continue fighting and die a glorious death, or flee to the camp, but a warrior named Socus freed Odysseus by piercing the hero with a spear. A wounded Odysseus to his knees, Asus came forward celebrating that he had struck down one of the bravest Greek warriors, but when he stepped up to strike the coup, Odysseus him in the throat with his sword, the Trojans were bewildered to witness such a scene and wondered how such a thing was possible. However, thanks to Athena, who slightly diverted Sa's strike, the Trojan's spear only pierced the edge of Odysseus' armor. This, since it had belonged to his father Lears, was a little loose on Odysseus' body, so he barely escaped with a bruise on his ribs. Ajax with his tower shield provided cover so that Odysseus into the fortification. The Trojan army finally broke down the gates of the wooden wall which had been raised to defend the ships, and the Greek camp. Hector felt that victory was within his grasp. Only a bit more pressure on the Greeks would cause their army to crumble. Agamemnon, Otus, and Diomedes groggily retreated to the glorious tent of King Myans. There they met with the other Greek chiefs to quickly decide on measures to contain the Trojan advance. Paris and Ananus burned the Greek ships that had already been conquered. The sons of Ares, Deos, and Phobos stood back as dread and despair spread through the Greeks' hearts. The Trojans had swarmed into the Greek camp, and the fight for the ships had begun. Supported by Zeus, the warriors of Hector pursued the decisive victory that would rid Troy of its enemies. Led by Ajax and unaware of the will of the supreme god, the Greek coalition warriors were fighting for their lives like a beast hunted by its predator. While the great Greek leaders who had been wounded the day before were debating their options, surrender would surely mean a death sentence. Agamemnon broached the possibility of pushing the ships back into the sea and returning to Greece, an angry great leader saying that with such an attitude he was not worthy of commanding the alliance from the heights of Olympus. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon watched the despair of their protégés without being capable of doing anything. Zeus had barged them from helping them directly. The Olympian queen was convinced that something had to be done, even if it went against her husband's will. The goddess knew she would not succeed in changing her husband's will through reason. Instead, she decided to act using the ways of Eros and Aphrodite, wearing her most beautiful robes and pouring over her body the finest perfumes. But she knew she needed another artifact, the belt of Aphrodite, which made the goddess of love irresistible to any man or god. The queen got Aphrodite to lend her belt without revealing the intent behind it. After all, the goddess of love was a Trojan ally. Hera went to Mount Ida, from where her husband commanded war. He was impressed to see how exquisite and seductive his wife was while the god was busy. Hypnos, the god of sleep, in league with the goddess, used his powers to make the gods slumber without the supreme god's hindrance. The gods, allied to the Greeks, were free to provide aid to their protégés. With Zeus now off the fight, Poseidon sided with the Greeks and had inspired them with uncanny bravery that stopped the Trojan advance. The Ons struggled to defend their ships as if these were their true homes. Hector threw his spear at Ajax the Great, hoping to knock out the Greeks' resistance, but as if deflected by the gods, Hector's spear skimmed across Ajax's chest without doing him any damage. But Ajax's counterattack would prove terrible, for Hector, the gigantic Greek warrior, threw a heavy stone at the Trojan hero. Hector was struck violently on the leg, leading the Trojan prince to the ground. With the help of his companions, Hector was taken out of the forefront without his great hero to lead them. The pressure of the Trojan attack finally began to ease. It was at this point that Zeus, who was peacefully sleeping on Hera's lap, awoke. He was suddenly overcome with anger, realizing what had happened on the battlefield, and that it was his wife's doing. Zeus threatened and scolded her. He asked her if the goddess's wish was again to be hung in the heavens, just like when she and the other gods had rioted against him. But since she was still using Aphrodite's belt, Zeus's anger found no room in his heart. Zeus ordered Apollo to heal the leg of the Trojan champion. In the meantime, Hector could return to the command of his men and fulfill the plan laid out by Zeus. The Greeks shuddered as they heard Hector's mighty war cry, which sounded more like a lion's roar. The enemies had spotted him fall, and now he was returning as if unscathed from the world of the dead, while the Greeks ceded land to their enemies. Patrus and Achilles' tent begged the greatest hero among the Greeks to put aside all the humiliations he had suffered and help his decimated compatriots if that was his men's wish. Achilles said then Patrus could put on his armor and lead his valiant Meridan against the Trojans. While Patrus was putting on Achilles' armor, his friend gave him one Last piece of advice: Achilles told Patrus to drive the Trojans out of the Greek camp but not to pursue his enemies. If they ran away, however, his main advice was that his beloved comrade should not try to engage Hector in battle. The young Patrus did not know it, but he was gearing up to change the course of the war for good. The Greeks were struggling frantically to protect their ships and prevent the Trojans from setting them on fire. The Trojans sensed that the long-awaited victory was within their grasp. But they had no idea that their luck was about to change. The sound of the wheels of Achilles' chariot pulled by the two divine horses Xanthus and Pallas made the Trojans' hearts tremble. Patrus, wearing Achilles' armor, headed the mighty Myrmidons off to fight their enemies. Frightened and eager to save their own lives, the Trojans on the forefront fled in confusion. Meanwhile they were pursued, and had their flanks baited at by the Greek spears from the top of Achilles' chariot. Patrus took out Trojans by the dozens with accurate stabs from his spears, but Sarpedon was a Trojan ally as well as king of Lycia and son of Zeus. He was bent on stopping the counterattack. Patrus leaped from the divine chariot and dashed against the son of Zeus. Sarpedon was strong and experienced, but his age had eroded his endurance. He was not up to the task of fighting a warrior as good as Patrus, who had Achilles as his training opponent for most of his life from above. Zeus looked at his beloved son in peril of his life and thought of intervening, but was scolded by the other gods. It would be disgraceful for the gods to freely intervene in the destiny of men to save the life of one of their descendants. Just to avoid the pain of loss, Zeus resigned himself to let Sarpedon's fate be fulfilled. Patrus easily dodged the thrusts of King Lan's spear, just standing by to deliver the fatal blow. The Greeks rejoiced as they stripped Sarpedon's body of its glorious armor and weapons, however, sent by Zeus. Both Thanatos and Hypnos carried the dead king's body back to Lycia, preventing the corpse of Zeus's son from being defiled. Thus he could have a dignified funeral in his homeland. Patros's heart had started to be seized by pride, which made him believe that he could lead the capture of Troy that day, completely forgetting Achilles' warning not to pursue the Trojans, who fled behind the walls. On the very front of the Trojan wall stood Hector, but Pet did not look daunted by the presence of such a mighty hero. But Patros's shining moments were over. Zeus was sending Apollo to weaken the man who had killed his beloved son. Patros's spear broke, and the straps that tied Achilles' armor to his body snapped, rendering the hero defenseless. That's when a Trojan named Euphorbus struck Patrus in his flank. Attacking him with his spear, Hector drove his spear through the body of Achilles' cherished friend. With Patrus dying at his feet, Hector called him a fool to think he would take Troy that day, saying that the Trojan vultures would feast on his corpse. Patrus used his remaining strength to say that Hector was bragging about a victory that was not his. After all, the greatest blow he suffered was dealt by Zeus and Apollo. Then it would be Euphorbus's, and only then would come the one from the Trojan prince. The Greek hero also stated that by killing him he lured to himself the shadow of death that now surrounded Hector, because Achilles' revenge would fall heavily on the Trojan. Hector would carry Ael's armor back to Troy as a trophy and place it on an altar in honor of the gods. Meanwhile, Trojans and Greeks fought over the body of Patrus. With the arrival of the mighty Ajax, the Greeks succeeded in retrieving Patrus' body and bringing it back to the camp. The news of Patros's death changed the course of the war. Achilles was in his tent, utterly oblivious to what was happening during the battles outside the Trojan wall. Antyllus, the son of old Nestor, arrived with some grim news. The messenger had the message of Patros's death, and the chest of Peleus, his son, was overwhelmed with pain. Achilles was suffering from the thought that his best friend had not listened to his advice not to stand up to Hector. Patros's negligence had cost him his life. To make matters worse, Hector had taken Achilles' magnificent armor for himself. The weeping hero went to the beach, and his cries of excruciating pain were heard by his mother, who came up from the water to find out what was happening. Achilles told her about the death of his beloved friend and the loss of his armor. He could never get his revenge on Hector. Disarmed, but Thetis reassured her son and told him that she would return the next day with armor even more splendid than before. With it he would be able to accomplish his destiny. Thetis went to Olympus, where she found Hephaestus working in his divine forges she asked the craftsman deity to help her beloved son by making him new armor. Zeus owed a great debt of gratitude to Thetis. She had sheltered him when he was thrown off of Olympus. He assured her that he would make Achilles the most magnificent armor ever seen by human eyes. Ajax returned to the Greek camp carrying the body of Patroclus while his brothers in arms fended off the Trojan attacks that came at them like hungry hyenas. Then all but disarmed Achilles emerged and let out a mighty roar of war that frightened all the Trojan warriors. The body of the late warrior was at last safe. The goddess Hera prompted the sun god Helos to dive into the ocean early, prematurely putting an end to another battle day. She knew that Achilles without armor would not be able to lead the Greeks. The Trojans camping outside the Trojan wall discussed during the night the following actions to be taken. One Trojan nobleman urged his men to retreat inside the city, as Achilles' fury would be relentless. But Hector and other nobles refused to hide behind the walls as the gods were on their side. Once in the Greek camp, the nobles spent the night mourning the body of the bravest and wildest hero who tried to take the city in a single day. Achilles ordered Patroclus' body to be preserved. He would only receive the funeral rites after the hero brought the body of Hector the murderer in honor of the fallen. The next morning Thetis stood in front of Achilles' tent wearing the new armor and shield made by the most skillful of the gods. Achilles donned his new armor, and its golden color shone almost as brightly as the sun. No man had ever worn such magnificent armor. Peleus requested an assembly of the Greek nobles as he had an important pronouncement to make. Standing in front of all noblemen, Achilles reconciled with Agamemnon and regretted that everything had not been settled on the very first day. Agamemnon apologized to the hero for having offended him so deeply, but everything he did was due to the will of the gods, and no man would oppose it. Agamemnon returned all of Achilles' stolen treasures, including the slave's Brias that Peleus' son held so dear. When she saw Patroclus' body, she wept over it, as he had always been very kind to her. Achilles was now leading the Greek army on an assault to avenge Patroclus' death. The Greeks marched confidently with him, as they had the best warrior in the world at their side. Achilles and his men fought their opponents. All those who dared to counter Peleus' rage met Charon the Fairman. Achilles fought with unfathomable anger and took the lives of the Trojans and their allies by the dozen. The gods watched his anger, and Zeus sensed that at that pace the hero would bring the war to an end that very day, and so he released the gods to act upon the conflict in whatever way best suited them. Hera, Athena, and Poseidon sided with the Greeks, while Apollo, Ares, and Aphrodite sided with the Trojans. With the gods on the battlefield, the war returned to the path laid out by the Moai. The ladies of fate, Ares joined forces against Athena, as he was still angry with the goddess for having helped the hero Diomedes wound him. The powerful goddess, employing her sheer strength, threw her brother to the ground and taunted him for thinking he could measure up to Zeus's favorite daughter. Aphrodite stood between Athena and Ares to protect her lover, but Athena landed a powerful punch to the chest of the goddess of love. She fell at Ares' side, and Athena told them that it was the deserved consequence for those who supported the hateful Trojans near their. Poseidon teased Apollo to fight, but heard the light god's reader saying it was not worthy for two deities of their level to fight each other over mere mortals. Artemis, who sided with the Trojans, taunted her brother for refusing to fight his uncle and said that his bow and arrows were useless. Hera snatched the bow from Artemis's hands and struck her with her own weapon. She told her that a child like her was not supposed to be there, and that she had to go play with her pets in the forest. Emes walked to her powerful father, and while crying on his lap, he asked her who had hurt her. The hunting goddess replied that Hero was responsible and that his wife was determined to bring dissension between the gods and men, and seemed to be pleased with it despite the gods' interference. Achilles pushed on relentlessly, and seemed determined to bring back Hector's head even if he had to tear down the Trojan gates with his bare hands and drag the Trojan prince by the hair. Achilles was marching relentlessly towards the city of Troy, while many Trojans fled in desperation, but one man did not fear the dreadful son of Thetis, the daring Prince Onus. Achilles called the prince a fool for believing that if he defeated the champion of the Ons he would only become king of the Trojans after Priam's death, as an ancient prophecy said. He added that by facing him he would only advance his meeting with Charon. The boatman Onus retorted by saying that he was not there to hurl insults. If he wanted to advance towards Troy he would have to run over him. The two noble heroes proceeded to duel. Onus gave his all in attacking and dodging the attacks of Pele's son. On the other hand, Achilles fought provocatively, almost carelessly, before the warriors who were witnessing the combat. Poseidon watched the contest between the heroes from a distance. Even though he hated the Trojans, he knew that the gods did not want Onus to fall before Achilles. When he felt that the prince was greatly handicapped, he realized that he would have to act. Onus was weak and Achilles was ready to give the final blow, but Poseidon brought a clown that obstructed Achilles' vision. The god would take Onus to safety, away from his enemy Jaws. When the cloud dissipated, the Dardanian hero was no longer there. Achilles realized that Aeneas was indeed beloved by the gods. In the vicinity, the mermaids were facing the Trojan lines and taking the lives of many Trojans as revenge for Patroclus' death. Achilles and his Meridian took several prisoners. Many were noble children of the most prestigious Trojan families. However, this time Achilles would not trade them for a generous ransom. Their lives would be offered to the gods as a sacrifice during Patroclus' funeral. The war was at one of its most heated moments. Achilles was killing more enemy warriors on the banks of the river Scamander than ever before. That day the blood of the fallen dribbled into the river, renaying its water. Achilles invaded the river waters to chase the Trojans who were trying to escape, but many of those who escaped from the hero's terrible spear met an even worse fate, drowning in the river due to their armor's weight. But Scamander, the river deity that gave the river its name, was enraged at Achilles for polluting his waters and would not let that insult go unpunished. The enraged river god made a massive water wall appear and threw it at Achilles. Achilles was battered by the mighty water whirlwind spawned by Scamander. His glorious armor crafted by the gods was worthless without air in his lungs, but Hera would not allow Achilles to die and turned to her son Hephaestus for help. The god of the forges brought forth a mighty fire that dried up the river, and Achilles was able to escape from the grip of death. After catching his breath, Achilles would drive to the Trojan gates to challenge Hector in an attempt to avenge the death of his dear friend on the battlefield. For almost a decade, men and gods were eagerly awaiting the encounter of the two greatest warriors of the Trojan War. Achilles, the Greek champion, was overwhelmed by the will and wished to avenge the death of his beloved friend Patroclus, while Hector, the bravest of all the Trojans, was battling to defend his homeland, his people, and his family. While advancing, Achilles' eyes burned with the hatred he felt for his opponent. Albeit invisible to human eyes, Phobos, the personification of fear, stood next to him. Hector's spirit was filled with dread, and his instinct for survival made the warrior flee 3 paintings in a row from the walls of Troy. King Priam, his wife Hecuba, and their princes worriedly watched Hector being pursued by Achilles, who like a hungry predator was chasing his prey. Hector avoided the arrows and javelins thrown by the warriors following Achilles. Peleus, his son, yelled, ordering his men to stop attacking the Trojan prince, as he would be responsible for sending Hector's spirit straight to Hades. Zeus commanded his golden scales to be brought out because the time had come to decide Hector's fate. His fate was weighed, and Achilles' platter rose toward glory, while Hector's platter dipped down toward Hades. Hector's fate had been sealed by the gods. Zeus directed Athena to come down to earth and enforce the fate set out for the warriors by the Morai. Ino whispered in Achilles' ear for him to stop pursuing his enemy, that she would encourage him to fight. Hector then listened to his brother Debucal and was delighted to have his brother by his side in a time of need. The prince found his courage again, and was now ready to at last face the champion. Hector attempted to reach an agreement with Achilles whereby the corpse of the warrior who fell after the duel would be given back to his friends to receive the proper funeral rites and tributes, but Achilles countered, saying that there was no such thing as an agreement between lions and men, and that it was the will of the gods to grant him victory. He would toss the prince's body to be gobbled up by the hungry dogs. The two greatest warriors met in front of Troy's mighty gates, while the Trojans watching from the top of the walls held their breath. This clash could change the war's outcome. Hector launched his spear at Peleus, but he easily dodged it using the divine armor bestowed by Hephaestus. The Trojan prince beckoned his brother to hand him his spear, but Deiphobus was absent. Hector realized he had been deceived by the gods and that Athena had disguised herself as his brother to motivate him. Though he knew that the gods were not with him this time, Hector would not let himself be taken over by fear. He pulled out his sword and charged forward to meet his fate. The king and queen on the walls feared for the life of their beloved son and worried about their kingdom's fate should Hector fall. The prince was bravely contending against the world's most powerful warrior. The heroes charged each other in a fight that seemed like a deadly ballet. Within seconds of fighting, Achilles had understood how Hector behaved in combat. No enemy's blows could reach him, and now he only expected the prince to reveal a vulnerable point for the fight to be decided. Hector bravely stepped forward against Pele's son with one perfect blow. Achilles fatally clipped Hector's neck. The great duel was set. Groans of pain and despair took over the Trojan walls, and everyone mourned the death of the noblest of all Trojans, Princess Andromache. Hector's wife collapsed upon knowing that her husband had died, and that little Anx was now an orphan with the spear still stuck in his neck. Hector begged Achilles to deliver his body to his parents in exchange for a great ransom in gold, but the ruthless Achilles replied that he would not. His body was meant to be eaten by the dogs and vultures that roamed the Greek camp. In his last breath, Hector cursed Achilles and threatened that the god Apollo would be in charge of avenging him. Achilles, however, said that he did not fear his meeting with Thanos. He had already accomplished his destiny by killing the best Trojan of them all, and his name would now be hailed for centuries to come. Hector's spirit went to Hades, but his body would still suffer much humiliation. Achilles bound the prince's ankles with a rope and fastened the rope to his chariot. Achilles dragged Hector's body with his chariot through the entire city of Troy, revealing to every citizen of the city that their champion was now dead, and along with the prince all hopes for Troy. Upon witnessing his son's body being dragged in front of the walls, Priam tried to throw himself from the top to take his own life, but was halted by his sons. Meanwhile, Hecuba the queen was shrieking and tearing her hair out. Achilles dragged Hector's body towards the Greek camp and was greeted by the Greek warriors wherever he went, saluting his victory. Having exacted his revenge, Achilles was at last ready to provide his faithful friend Patroclus with a proper burial. Achilles triumphantly returned to the Greek camp, carrying with him the body of the Trojan warrior who inhabited the nightmares of nearly all the warriors, afraid that they would encounter Hector on the battlefield. Having fulfilled his promise, Achilles sent orders to initiate the funeral proceedings for Patroclus. Animal sacrifices were started, and Hector's body was ordered to be thrown to the ground and left at the mercy of dogs. During his sleep, Achilles was visited by Patroclus' spirit, who cried out for his friend to quickly perform the funeral rites. As he was being barred from entering the underworld, Achilles apologized to his fellow man and promised him that he would speed up the ritual. Patroclus reminded Achilles of his fate in war. He reminded him to make room next to his friend's grave so that he could be buried there. This way they could rest together as they had been together since childhood. 12 Trojan prisoners were slain with sword blows at Achilles' command because the Pele's desire for revenge was immense. At last Achilles gifted his locks as a tribute to his dead friend. Achilles had promised his father to give the locks to the river god of his homeland. When he returned, he asked the god for forgiveness, as he was not meant to return and fulfill his offering. The great Py was lit, and Achilles finally made good on his promise. Patroclus' spirit entered the realm of Hades and found rest in the Elysian fields. At night, the goddess AFC spread an ointment of ambrosia on Hector's cup so his corpse did not decompose even when exposed to the elements. She also kept a watchful eye over the body to scare off the dogs that wanted to feast on the corpse. Achilles continued to be anxious. He tied Hector's body to his chariot again, dragging his tormentor corpse around Patroclus' piece several times. Achilles in his tent was visited by Thetis, his divine mother. Upon seeing her son's agitation, she advised him to return Hector's body to his people. The gods were unhappy with the way that Peleus, his son, had treated the body of such an honorable warrior. Achilles said that if that was the god's will, he would allow the body to be returned. Iris, the divine messenger, went to Priam with the message that the king had to go to Achilles' tent to retrieve the body of his beloved son. He had no need to worry, for he would be under the god's protection. The sons of Priam attempted to dissuade him from leaving if he were captured by the Ons, Troy would suffer greatly. However, the king said that all his beloved sons were dead and he had only the worst of them left. He would do everything to bring back the body of his best son. Priam took a donkey-drawn cart to the Greeks' camp, unsure of how he would be received. Along the way the king encountered a man who said he would help him enter the On camp. Pri knew that this stranger could only be an envoy from the gods. As they arrived at the Greek camp gates, the mysterious man commanded that the gates be opened and was immediately attended to. Pri sensed that a god was at his side, and he was right at Zeus's order. Hermes would escort the king to assure his safety. Achilles was taken aback when he saw a noble elder walking into his tent. In a sign of great humility, Pri clasped the knees of the man who had taken the lives of almost all of his sons. He told Achilles to remember Peleus, his old father, who was probably as old as Priam, and how much he hoped for his son's return, or at least his body. He said that he had lost more than 50 sons, but he could not do without the body of the only one who was truly worthy of defending the city. For this reason he carried a generous handsome with him. Touched by the king's speech, Achilles brought him to his feet. He said that great would be Priam's suffering so as to have the courage to stand face to face with the most terrible of Greeks, and that an iron heart would be beating in his chest. Achilles replied that he would return Hector's body to his father. He had promised his divine mother that he would do so with great relief. After such stress the king finally relaxed. He ate and rested in Pel's tent. He had not eaten or slept since his son's death. Before sunrise, Priam and his divine escort departed, carrying the body of the glorious hero Hector. Before Agamemnon found out that the Trojan king was in his camp, Achilles apologized to Patroclus' spirit for returning Hector's body, saying that his part of the ransom would be laid at his tomb. Priam headed toward Troy with the promise of an 11-day ceasefire to ensure that all preparations were made for the funeral of the bravest Trojan. The Trojans rejoiced and wept watching the king carrying the Trojan prince's body. Thanks to Aphrodite's care, Hector's corpse was perfectly preserved, and he appeared to be sleeping serenely. Andromache, the hero's wife, grabbed her dead husband's head and regretted that his departure had left behind a widow and a helpless son who would certainly be persecuted by the Greeks. They would not allow poor Aeonyx to grow up and seek revenge. On the 11th day of the truce, Hector's enormous funeral was lit in the center of Troy. All the city's inhabitants grieved the departure to Hades of the only man capable of defending Troy against the Greeks. One of the Trojan War's saddest chapters had ended. Even without its champion, the city would continue to fight until its last gasp. Music. The Trojan War had already killed countless renowned warriors, but no loss had the impact of the fall of the Trojan prince Hector. Without the protection of their leader, the morale of the Trojan people was shattered. The armistice proposed by Achilles, which allowed Hector's funeral to take place, was coming to an end. Agamemnon took his men to the front of the Trojan walls and tried to challenge his opponents to a fight in the open field, but the Trojans didn't have the courage to come out from behind the mighty walls built by the gods. They saw Thanatos' terrible shadow at every corner, a sign that the ruin of the city was about to happen. King Priam regretted that he had lost so many sons in the war, but his grief was even greater that only his most cowardly sons had survived Paris, and Deiphobus in their hands would be the future of Troy, since the king did not want to give the city's command to the Braven Means. After all, there was a prophecy where he would be the great upholder of Trojan tradition, and the king had no wish to give that honor to Anchises' son. But as the goddess Aurora appeared, bringing with her the rising of a new day, a fresh hope appeared on the horizon. They were the brave and untamed Amazons, tremendous warriors, daughters of Ares, who fought on wild horses. Panthea, the queen of the Amazon, was beautiful, and her armor reflected the sun's rays. She even looked like the daughter of the goddess Aurora. The emergence of the dreadful warriors who feared no man filled the Trojan warriors' hearts with courage. Led by Ar's daughters, the Trojans came out from behind the walls to once again face the Greek army. The Amazons advanced against the Greek lines, who were stunned to see an army of women mounted on horses. Their attack was frightening, seeming to be inspired by Ares, their father, and Belos god. The Greeks began to flee to ships pursued by Queen Pelia, who killed dozens of warriors with her glorious axe offered by the god of war. Achilles and Ajax were surprised by The Greeks' disorderly flight, they shouted for the men to re-establish the defensive lines for Achilles and Ajax were now in their army's forefront. Encouraged by the two great heroes, the Greeks returned to the fight, and a great bloodbath began. Achilles' Trojans and Amazons spilled blood on Trojan soil in one of the most violent battles of the war. Achilles again began to turn the battle in favor of the Greeks, using Peleus' fabulous spear, but Penthesilea feared no man, not even the fearsome son of Thetis. Frightened the queen of the Amazon, mounted on her horse, she hurled a spear at the hero. Achilles blocked the attack and ordered his war chariot to be brought to him. The objective was to hunt down the brave Amazon pulled by the divine horses Pallas and Xanthus. Achilles pursued the warrior queen, who continued to hurl projectiles at him. Penthesilea turned around and raised to axe. Achilles was impressed by the courage of the fearless warrior, who looked more like Athena's incarnation. The queen of the Amazon fearlessly charged forward against the champion of the gods for the final showdown. Achilles pierced the horse's body and struck the Amazon's belly. In a blow delivered by his mighty spear, the queen and her horse fell mortally wounded. Achilles approached to examine Pentel's body. He could not believe that a woman would have the courage to challenge him. When even the mighty Hector trembled in his presence, he removed the queen's helmet, and was surprised. Not only was she really a woman, but she was one of the most beautiful girls he had ever seen. Achilles was touched by the queen's courage, and so he did not strip her of her weapons and armor as was his custom. Achilles turned Penes Alia's body to her subjects so that they could arrange a funeral to honor the woman's greatness. She had been braver than most of the great men who fought in the war. After defeating the fearless Amazon warriors, the Greeks began preparations for the assault on the Trojan walls. Many tall ladders began to be manufactured for the warriors to reach the top of the walls in Troy. The high-ranking nobility of Ilium were desperate. Some said that Helen of Troy should be handed over to the Greeks so that their fury could be controlled, avoiding a terrible fate for the city of Troy. But Paris found all this inconceivable. He said that returning Helen would in no way diminish the Greek warriors' bloodlust. At that moment the Ethiopian prince then appeared, leading his army of African warriors. He had skin as dark as ebony. He was strong as a bull, so strong that he could only be compared to Achilles, and just like the son of Thetis, Nan also had divine blood. He was the son of the goddess Aurora, with Tonus, brother of King Priam of Troy, and like the Greek, he also had divine armor made by the god of forges Nan led his men in a bloody battle against the Greeks. The Dark Prince claimed dozens of Greek lives. He seemed unstoppable, and the Greeks were taken aback, for they did not think they would ever again face an enemy as strong as Hector. Achilles wanted to face him, but was stopped by his divine mother. She warned him that this enemy could kill him in the next 24 hours. Therefore Nan fought on without finding any opponent to match him. On his chariot the old king Nestor of Chios commanded the Greek lines, trying to prevent them from being overthrown by the pressure of the African army. The Ethiopian prince realized that if he eliminated the Greek commander, the opponents would be left leaderless, and the Africans would be victorious. Nan advanced against Nestor, but his son Antus placed himself between the warrior and his old father to protect him. The African prince pierced the chest of Nestor's brave son with his spear. The old king tried to push Nan away from his son's body, preventing him from plundering the spoils. The Ethiopian said that he would not have attacked the old king due to the heat of the battle. He had only charged at him because he did not realize that he was an elder. Antyllus, like Patrus, was very dear to Achilles. Therefore the great Greek warrior forgot his mother's advice and tried to take revenge by fighting Nan. The two great warriors began their duel, and the Ethiopian prince proved to be a formidable opponent. He was strong and skilled. Achilles felt that this warrior seemed to equal him in almost everything. That fighter might be destined to kill him, just as it had been prophesied since his childhood. Achilles used his spear to strike the African prince in the shoulder, but the blow only made men fight with even more devotion. Unlike any other opponent, Thetis and Aurora watched the duel between their sons with distress. They knew that only one would come out of the fight alive. Both asked Zeus to favor their respective sons, but he said that the fate of each warrior was already determined by the Moai. Not even he could go against the ladies of destiny. Nan wounded Achilles' hand with his spear, and the Greeks were shocked to see the divine champion bleeding so badly. The goddess of dawn stood behind her son and revealed Achilles' secret weakness, his heels. Non tried to surprise his opponent with an assault on his heels. But Achilles, the light-footed warrior, leapt on his opponent with one terrible blow. He claimed Manon's life. The body of the African prince was carried away by the deities of the winds, so just like Sarpedon he was buried with all the honors he deserved after defeating that mighty warrior. Nothing seemed impossible for Achilles, who would now lead the assault on the walls of Troy in search of ultimate glory. Achilles commanded the Trojan offensive in the final assault on the walls of Troy. He wanted to conquer the city that day, and everything looked favorable. Using their long ladders, the Greeks began trying to scale the walls while the Trojans mounted desperate defenses. Aunus led the Trojans outside the walls. If they could not destroy the great stairs, the city would be lost. Achilles, with his dreadful blows, kept sending Trojans to the kingdom of Hades. The defenders' fortitude was weakening. Afraid of dying, the Trojans began to flee while Achilles impaled them with pellets as spears. Suddenly Apollo appeared before Achilles and ordered him to stop the advance, for it was written in destiny that he would never overcome the Trojan walls. But Achilles ignored him and told the god to go back to the other deities. If he tried to stop him, Apollo would have a taste of Peleus' spear. Apollo gave way to the senseless Greek warrior, but he could not let him get away with such an insult. The excellent archer Paris focused as hard as he could. With the help of the luminous god, he fired a devastating arrow. Guided by Apollo, the prince's arrow hit Achilles' heel, his only weak point. Achilles was practically invulnerable, for his divine mother had performed a ritual where he was submerged in the waters of the sacred river, but the only unprotected part of his body was his heel, for it had not come into contact with the water. Mortally wounded, his blood flowed abundantly in the stricken area. Achilles called the one who struck him from behind, and at a safe distance. A coward, for his opponent did not have the courage to meet him face to face. Achilles still managed to stand up. He staggered forward against his enemies, managing to kill a few more enemies before running out of strength. To everyone's surprise, Achilles tumbled to the ground, and the sound of the impact of his armor against the ground was heard throughout the battlefield. The greatest of all heroes was dead. Paris celebrated the victory over the best Greek warrior and ordered the Trojans to plunder Achilles' weapons and armor. The Trojan soldiers who had previously fled rushed to pillage the hero's body. Ajax appeared on the scene, raising his mighty warhammer to scare away the Trojans trying to snatch Achilles' body. Odysseus gave cover to the strong Ajax so that he could put Achilles' body on his shoulders and set off for the Greek camp. Ajax used his enormous strength to quickly cross all the way to the camp. Many said that for this heroic feat he would pay a terrible price. Completely exhausted, Ajax accomplished his mission and rescued the body of his dear friend. Achilles' body received due care and was mourned by all the Greeks, who grieved the departure of the most glorious warrior among them. Thetis appeared in the sea waters to bid farewell to the son she had tried so hard to divert from his fate. She covered her son's body with her tears, and everyone present was moved by that mournful scene. Achilles was cremated on a huge funeral pyre worthy of the greatest of kings. His bones were buried next to the remains of his beloved friend Patrus. They met again on the Elysian fields. Music. After Achilles' funeral, the goddess Thetis, the hero's mother, offered her son's armor to the Ons. It was to be given to the one who had rendered the greatest assistance to Peleus, and Thetis, his son Ajax, considered himself the only man worthy of such honor, for it was he who had taken the hero's body from the grip of the Trojan warriors. But Odysseus objected and said that he himself was the one who deserved to inherit Achilles' breastplate. Ajax was furious with Odysseus. He claimed that the comparison between the two was preposterous, as it would be the same as equating a dog to a lion. The giant also said that if it were not for him, Achilles would have his head on a stake and his spirit would roam the banks of the river Acheron. But if it were not for him who contained nearly a dozen Trojans, Ajax would never be able to carry the body, and that it was he who found Achilles and convinced him to fight. Without that, the entire Greek expedition would have been lost. Old Nestor suggested a competition to decide who was most worthy of such an honor. Ajax and Odysseus spoke before Everyone defending their causes. Ajax was brave and worthy, but he did not possess the power of speech. But Odysseus lose, and Agamemnon convinced the council to give Odysseus from getting even more prestige and power upon seeing Odysseus being presented with Hephaestus' divine armor. Ajax's blood boiled to such an extent that he felt ill even, and having a stroke he became motionless in front of everyone, and had facial paralysis. In his tent he seemed to recover from his malaise, but he was still outraged at the humiliation he had suffered. He wanted to make the Atreus pay for conspiring against him. At that moment the goddess Athena appeared behind him and clouded his judgment. Ajax was completely beside himself. He came out of the tent with his weapon, determined to take revenge. Two of Agamemnon's guards tried to stop him but failed. He suddenly saw Atreus' two sons, who seemed startled to see Ajax's hateful face. The giant lunged forward with bloodlust against Minos and Agamemnon. Ajax mortally struck Minos, then he strangled Agamemnon until he took away his last breath of life. Even after killing the two sons of Atreus, Ajax's thirst for revenge remained unquenchable. He went to Odysseus' tent and dragged him out. His opponent would not die as quickly as the others. He tied him to a rock and began to whip him. That's when the Athena induced confusion dissipated and Ajax realized that he was flogging a ram. And everyone witnessed the grotesque scene in shock as he killed the other lambs. He thought the animals were Minos and Agamemnon, for he shouted their names during the slaughter. Again humiliated before everyone, he ran back to his tent. He called his slave Tisa, whom he had taken as his wife, and he said that he could not stand the humiliation, so he would depart from the world. His wife and son would have to seek out Teucer, his brother, so that the Greek leaders would not enslave them. Ajax held a sword against his chest and threw himself to the ground against it. The war's second greatest warrior, second only to Achilles, died. Agamemnon wanted to deny him the right to the funeral because he had betrayed everyone, and that had it not been for Athena confounding him, Ajax would have killed him plus his brother. But Odysseus convinced the supreme leader to bury the hero with all the honors of a great fighter. Had it not been for Ajax and his great shield, the Trojans would have burned all the Greek ships. Thanks to the intervention of the king of Ithaca, the mighty Ajax was veiled and honored as a great music warrior. The Greek leaders were worried. The death of two of their most powerful warriors, Achilles and Ajax, made it almost impossible to conquer the city of Troy. Although they had weakened their opponents, something beyond their comprehension prevented the Ons from overcoming the Trojan wall. With Odysseus' help, the seer Calypso learned of the prophecies of Helenus the seer, who was Priam's son. They ensured the safety of the city of Calypso revealed to the Greek leaders that Troy could only be conquered by men using the weapons of the great hero Hercules. Furthermore, the city would not fall without having someone with the blood of the great Achilles, and there was also a sacred artifact that protected the city. It was the Palladium kept inside Troy in Athena's temple. Odysseus wanted to end it quickly. He said he would find the solution to all those shenanigans. The king of Ithaca headed in his ship to King Lysa's palace, the same place where he had found Achilles hidden. Among the king's daughters he came across a young man. This one was training against two strong opponents at the same time. The warriors, although experienced, could not hold the young warrior back. He was not just anybody. His name was Pyrrhus, and the Greeks called him Neptus, which meant the new warrior in his veins. He had Achilles' blood. Father of the young warrior with the princess Demia. The princess felt a déjà vu when she saw Odysseus, her son, for war, just as he had done with her beloved Achilles. Odysseus' weapons and armor which were in his custody. He said that the lives of thousands of Greeks depended on the lad. Pyrrhus would not allow his father's sacrifice to be in vain and agreed to accompany Odysseus. A new reinforcement had arrived to help the Trojans. The warrior Eurus brought with him fresh troops sent by allied cities to Troy with few heroes to take the lead. The Greeks began to give way before the enemy they were not ready to contain. That renewed force. Suddenly the Trojans and allies halted their advance. They couldn't believe their eyes. Achilles seemed to have returned from the dead. Pyrrhus, who was wearing his father's armor, leaped out a powerful battle cry. The enemies began to flee, fearing death, but Eurypylus tried to stop the flight, saying that they were fleeing from a child wearing his father's robe. Ilus advanced against Neptus, who did not hesitate to face him, the young Pyrrhus leaped on his enemy with one perfect blow. He struck Ilus lethally. The witnesses to that scene had no doubt Pyrrhus was the son of the glorious Achilles. With Neotus' arrival, the morale of the Greek warriors improved. The Trojans hid behind the walls again. Pyrrhus had a triumphant debut on the battlefields once dominated by his late father. The Greeks now carried a new warrior on their shoulders, celebrating victory. The first hurdle had been cleared now. Odysseus' weapons. The king of Ithaca knew where he had last found one of them, but he also knew that it would not be easy to convince the owner to take it to the Trojan shores. After taking Achilles' son to Troy, Odysseus him great embarrassment. He was to find Hercules' weapons, and he knew very well where they were. On the island of Lemnos was Philes, the warrior who had been abandoned there almost 10 years ago because of his snake injury. He felt a great hatred for Odysseus. Asked the hero for forgiveness, for Phylides was heir to Hercules' bow, and his magnificent arrows bathed in the Lawn Hydra's blood. But the forsaken hero would not pardon the Greeks. He turned his back on Odysseus to Troy. Hercules, who after his death went to live with the gods, spoke in Philo's ear. He told him that he had given him the bow to take him to Troy, and that his destiny would be fulfilled that way. After Hercules' intervention, Odysseus and the divine bowed to the shores of Troy. The serpent wound, the reason for his abandonment, still had a putrid odor, but Philippes was miraculously treated by the best physician of the Greeks. The hero, who before could barely put his foot down, was completely cured. Everyone was amazed by the miracle. At that moment the gods seemed to favor the Greeks. They were preparing for another assault on the walls of Troy. The protectors were weak, but the strong defensive position was a huge advantage. Aunus led the Trojans and their allies in defending the base of the wall, preventing the Greeks from climbing it. Meanwhile, Paris provided cover for Aunus, commanding the archers who fired the projectiles from the top of the wall. Neotus embodied his father's spirit. By the start of the fight, he had already slaughtered more than 10 enemies. Paris seemed to be having a déjà vu. He had a feeling if he could shoot down the mighty Achilles with his arrows, then he could also shoot down his son Philes with his divine bow, would not allow the cowardly Trojan prince to bring down another Greek hero. He struck straight at the Trojan prince, who felt intense pain much greater than normal wound. Paris cried out in pain as he was accosted by his brother Deiphobus, but they did not know that the arrow had been bathed in the poisonous blood of the Hydra of Lna. Few people in the world knew the antidote to that poison. The Trojans managed to repel the Greek attack, but the prince and heir to the throne lay dying on his bed. No Trojan physician knew how to help him. Paris remembered Oen, the nymph to whom he had vowed love before he met Helen. She knew the secrets of herbs and could cure any ailment. Paris was carried on a stretcher to the nymph's dwelling at the foot of Mount Ida. The Trojan prince threw himself at Anant's feet and begged for help, but time and bitterness had hardened the nymph's heart. She told the prince to seek salvation in Helen, whom he had chosen as his wife. With great pain in her heart, O refused to render aid to the only love of her life. By the time the men carrying Paris returned to Troy, the prince's spirit had departed for Hades. Helen mourned the death of Paris. Meanwhile, Deiphobus and his brother Helenus fought to decide who would be the new husband of the world's most beautiful woman. Paris's body burned on the funeral pile. Hidden, the nymph Oen saw everything. She felt enormous pain in guilt for having let her beloved Paris die in an act of love and desperation. The nymph threw herself into the flames and burned to ashes, holding her music beloved. Upon Paris's death, Helen was forced to marry Prince Deiphobus. Enormous sadness plagued Helen's heart, and she felt guilty for the mistakes she had made in the past, which had led to the deaths of thousands of men and were the root of tremendous unhappiness at this stage of the war. The other women of Troy hated Helen. She could see the contempt in their eyes. She was held guilty for all the tragedy in the kingdom of Troy outside the walls. Odysseus that prevented the city from being taken. The city of Troy would not fall if they had the Palladium of Athena within their walls, but the cunning Odysseus Diomedes beat and whipped Odysseus. His plan: Odysseus put on a tattered tunic and knocked at the gates of Troy. For help the disguised Odysseus received the Trojans, saying he was a foreign merchant captured by the Greeks while trying to smuggle supplies into Troy. He Said he almost died after being tortured for days on end but had managed to escape during the night. Helen, hearing that man's voice, was sure that she already knew him to clear up any doubts. She said that her maids would take care of the visitor. Helen's handmaidens bathed Odysseus and tended to his wounds. When Odysseus that were offered to him, Helen entered his quarters, seeing the king of Ithaca clean and without his hood, she recognized him. Immediately she told Zeus to be quiet, for she would not alert the Trojans about the spy who was now within the walls. After all, she was there only as a slave. During the night, Odysseus sneaked to Athena's temple with the help of the gods. The guard experienced a heavy sleep. Odysseus that protected the city in his escape from Troy. Under Athena's protection, he eliminated the guards standing in his way, and the Palladium prophecy had been solved. After showing off the Palladium to all the Greek warriors, the leaders of the Ons motivated the troops to prepare for the ultimate assault on the city of Troy. The Trojan archers standing on the walls continued to repel the attempted assault, but the brilliant Odysseus' strategy, the Greek warriors advanced together shoulder to shoulder with their shields raised. They looked like a great turtle. The Trojans' arrows would come soon. In heaven, the sun accused men of profaning his sacred cattle. He said that he would go to Hades to illuminate the dead, while the earth and heavens would no longer see his light. Zeus pleaded with Helios not to stop illuminating the world, as he would end the lives of those responsible for such a crime. The headwind ceased, and Odysseus the island of Thia behind, but the thunderbolts in the sky pointed to Zeus's foul mood. A powerful lightning strike shattered the ship mast, collapsing on the helmsman. Further lightning struck the ship, utterly destroying it. Many of Odysseus' men died by electrocution, while others drowned in the seawaters. Lysa's son survived by grabbing onto the planks of the ship's wreckage. He would be the only one not to have his body swallowed by the sea. He would drift for a while until realizing that the currents were taking him towards a dreadful fate. Odysseus and Charybdis. The wreckage was being tugged by Charybdis' whirlpool, and his end seemed inevitable, but he managed to reach the branches of a fig tree that sprang up by the walls hanging from it. The hero waited until Charybdis had swallowed all the water, as he always did. The water flow reversed, and Odysseus, using the strength of his arms and legs as he attempted his best to distance himself from that place for days, Odysseus drifted sea until he was carried to the shores of the Ogygia island, where the nymph Calypso lived. After describing his stay on Calypso's island and how he had arrived in the land of the fashions, Odysseus concluded his adventures at the court of King Alinus. Overwhelmed with emotion, Odysseus that almost all of his companions who perished on his journey cried out for his name in despair before they took their last breath. While Odysseus was trying to return home, his son Tachus had departed for the Greek region of the Pippins in search of his father. He had the goddess Athena by his side, disguised as a mentor. His first stop was Chios, the kingdom of the wise. Old Nestor, a famous hero from the Trojan War. The old king and his 2 sons were making sacrifices to the god Poseidon. They invited the young man and his chaperone to join them in the ceremony. Tellus introduced himself as Odysseus, his son, and Nestor was happy to meet the young man his father had mentioned so much. Unfortunately, however, and had no news of Odysseus. King was one of the 4 great heroes who had not made it home safely. Soon after the war ended, the mighty King Agamemnon had been murdered by his wife, and her lover Ajax the Great had died on the sea's dew as a result of the gods' rage, and Minos had been lost for 8 years before returning home, but he knew nothing about Odysseus' whereabouts. The wise Nestor recognized that Teluk was quite a valuable person, for he had the goddess Athena by his side. He recommended that the prince of Ithaca meet with Menus, as he would know